We're back at the 28th Vigil for Julian Assange, a special edition this Thursday, May 2nd, the date that Julian Assange appeared via video link from Belmarsh Prison to the Magistrates Court in London for the beginning of this extradition process that the United States wants him to stand trial in the United States in Alexandria courtroom for supposedly intruding a government computer. But of course, we all fear that they will add charges to that from the Espionage Act, and that, in fact, we discussed in the first part of this program with Patrick extensively about the Espionage Act and its use in this case. And the fear here is that Britain will extradite him, but that it is a long process and that the substantive hearing is June 12th, but that we expect it to go on beyond that. So I'm joined live by George Samueli, who is an academic, and he's been a frequent guest. And we're going to try to get George's views. Before he came on, I briefed him on what I discussed about the ombudsman in Ecuador, saying, that Julian being expelled from the embassy was, in fact, a de facto extradition without any due process, that he was kicked out of Ecuadorian territory and handed over to British territory, and that is an extradition. And his suspension of his passport, his citizenship, was indeed also against Ecuadorian law. Essentially, by the way, the extradition is against the constitution in Ecuador. An Ecuadorian citizen cannot be extradited. That's what the ombudsman said, and there was an extradition, and you cannot have your passport and your citizenship suspended without due process, without a hearing, without time to prepare a defense, without the right to appeal, and that happened as well. So, George, welcome.
Well, I think everything you have just said is absolutely right, Joe, because what happened when he was seized in the embassy was complete violation of any international law, because he was an Ecuadorian citizen, and if the British were executing a warrant, then that warrant would have had to go through the legal process of any country. And they would have a response to the warrant, and the court would then have to enforce the warrant. But none of that happened. And the Ecuadorian government hasn't even made any pretense of any of that having happened. In fact, all they said is that, well, we throw him out because we just didn't like him. And he was supposedly, smearing feces on the walls. And that's all there is to it. That's, you don't revoke people's citizenship because they behave badly. So in fact, the Ecuadorian government has made not even the slightest pretense of any of this following the law. And neither is the British government. The British government has never said, well, we actually made an appeal to the Ecuadorian courts, and we're trying to enforce our warrant. I mean, nothing. They just said we went in because, well, this is Britain and the British laws apply. Well, they don't actually apply on Ecuadorian soil, and they don't apply in the laws of on the soil of any other country. I mean, the British may have this illusion that they apply everywhere in the world. They don't. So it was flagrantly illegal for them just to storm into Ecuadorian territory and to seize him. So you're absolutely right. I mean, that the outrage is just stem from there, and everything that they've been saying. I mean, that ridiculous judge in the hearing yesterday with the on the bail issue. I mean, everything in which she was saying about how, well, he would, he eschewed the British legal system that would have protected all his due rights. Well, in what way has the British system protected any of his rights? How have they done that? How have they actually even done the minimum which they could have done, which is to say that if they did extradite him to Sweden, they could have easily insisted on Sweden not extraditing him to a third country. That would have been that's a minimum. I mean, if the British are really in the business of protecting defendants' rights, then they said you cannot extradite him to a third country, and that the only thing that we're going to extradite him for is specifically on this European arrest warrant in which he's supposedly going to be answering questions that the Swedish prosecutor wants answered. That's it. So the British have made no attempt at any of that. And in fact, as you know, their actions have been exactly the opposite of protecting his rights. That they were egging on the Swedes to keep this prosecution going, even though the Swedes really wanted to bring it to an end. And so they said, no, just keep it going. Even though the Swedes were saying, look, this is disproportionate. This has been going on for years. And the charges don't merit this amount of time. But it's British saying, no, you've got to keep it going. So for the judge to say, well, his rights would have been protected by the British legal system, I mean, it's just absolutely contemptible.
It is indeed. In fact, what we learned from that FOIA that Stefania Maurizi of the La Repubblica was able to get was that the British government was pressuring Sweden not to come to the UK to interview Julian Assange at the embassy, which he was willing to be interviewed while he was still in Sweden. They let him leave Sweden to go to the UK. I guess he wishes he'd gone to a different country, but he went to the UK. And then they issued this red notice from Interpol against him. So that was a trap. And they eventually did come, the prosecutor, to London and did interview him in the embassy, despite the pressure from the British not to do that. And that was when they dropped the case. For the second time. So the idea that he is going to be serving 11 months in jail for skipping bail on a case that doesn't even exist anymore.
So now it was delayed today simply because the Americans haven't completed the extradition request. I mean, what was the reason for today's delay?
I don't know, but it appears to me that the judge, which is Judge Snow, the same one who called him a narcissist in the hearing about the bail skipping, that it appears that they just wanted to take statements, I guess, from both sides. All we've seen is this one quote from Assange. There were a lot of reporters who could not get into the courtroom because at the last minute they changed from a large courtroom to a small one, saying that only the small courtroom had the facilities to take the testimony from Assange via video link. Now, they had to know that yesterday, that the small courtroom is the only one. They knew he was going to do a video link. Why all of a sudden they said the last minute? So it was pretty fishy. There's a lot of belief that it was purposely, people were misled and they used a small courtroom so that fewer supporters and journalists can get in. And we already know from Jen Robinson's speech what the contours of his legal defense will be, that he was only helping his source hide her identity, and that there is no crime here, and that the indictment is a fraud, basically, and that therefore he should not be extradited.
Right.
This is not about that case, George. You know that. Everybody knows that. It's not about alleged hacking, which doesn't appear in the indictment, but does in the headline of the Justice Department press release about the indictment. It's not about intrusion to a government computer, because Chelsea Manning already had legal access to those documents.
Yes.
And all he was doing was trying to help her get a password so she could hide her identity by logging in under a different way. It's not about any of that. It's about what he's published, what crimes he's revealed, and they got to punish him and stop him and try to stop WikiLeaks from doing any more of that. Their impunity that they act with was tampered with. Tampered with. And they're not going to settle for that. And they really, they are hell-bent on getting this man in jail. And unfortunately, the British government being a part of this American imperial system, I think they piggy bank. Well, when they lost their empire, they just decided to join the American one, to kind of run it jointly. Right. So he's never left the prison. He appeared. He made this tremendous statement today, and this will go on for weeks.
Yeah, I thought his statement yesterday to the judge, the so-called quote apology unquote, was also very good, because he didn't apologize. I mean, it was a good statement. He said, "Look, I mean, things developed the way I regret, but I had no choice. In what happened.
Right.
things developed in this way, obviously, the whole thing has been so awful. 7 years essentially imprisonment, but it was by no means any kind of an apology. And I thought that it was a good statement.
Very carefully crafted, I thought.
Yes.
He said, "I'm sorry that this happened," which he is, and he had no choice, which he didn't, and that what was the last part of that? So yeah, and that he didn't want to have this to take the course that it did, and regrets that it did, which he does. He regrets he had to go into the bloody embassy, but he's not saying I'm sorry about causing the taxpayers. That's really interesting. The judge talked about the money that it cost the British taxpayers. Right. Now, you tell me, George, give me an example of another case where a guy skips bail on a case that's been dropped. Yes. And then £64 million worth of surveillance is spent to make sure. Yes. I mean, please.
Yes, quite so. I mean, if one could turn around to the British government, if you're so concerned with the taxpayer, why couldn't you work out a perfectly reasonable accommodation with Julian Assange? He surrenders to you. You rap him on the knuckles. He serves 3 months in jail, and then he's out of there. That's it. And then you could save everybody time and money, and the taxpayer wouldn't have to worry about anything. So the idea of blaming him for the fact that the British government behaved in this reckless, idiotic manner of surrounding this embassy with this massive police presence and then setting up all these security cameras, well, that had nothing to do with him. It was the British government that made that decision. They elected not to come to a reasonable accommodation with Julian's lawyers.
WikiLeaks pointed out in a tweet that the speedboat killer, I'm not quite sure what that case is, but that he skipped bail in the UK and he got 3 months in jail for skipping bail. That's it. Yeah. Did they spend 64 million quid surveilling that guy? I hardly think so. And he was a murderer.
Right. Yeah, exactly. He was a murderer. And here, you still don't have any crime. I mean, the Swedes have still not come up with this crime. They've not charged him with anything. I mean, they've had 10 years in which to charge him with a crime. They haven't. I mean, so they've dropped the case twice. And even now, they don't seem to be very enthusiastic about, restarting it. And I don't think they can restart it. I mean, I don't think, I'm not sure at all that the evidence is available. So it's not as though the way the media are reporting it as if the Sweden can tomorrow just restart the case. I mean, I don't think he can restart it. I'm not at all sure that those women will be willing witnesses in any kind of a case against him. So the whole thing is just an absurdity.
Yes. And as Jen Robinson said today, despite what you heard from the prosecutor in the courtroom today, that indicates, by the way, that the prosecutor did get to speak, which I imagine. We just don't know what the prosecutor said yet, if we're ever going to find out. Who's
the prosecutor? Is the American?
I don't know, but funny thing is, in that first hearing where he was called a narcissist, and that was over him skipping bail on the Swedish charge, right?
Yes.
Nothing to do with the U.S. indictment.
That's right.
It was reported that the lawyer arguing against Assange was a British lawyer, an English guy, but he was representing the United States government.
It was a British
I found guy. Yeah, but why was the United States government represented in the hearing on the bail skipping that had to do with Sweden? I mean, they had put the extradition request in, and they had an arrest warrant for him, the U.S., that same day. So he was arrested on 2 arrest warrants, one, the bail skipping one, and then the American. That hearing only had to do with bail skipping, and yet there was a lawyer there in the U.S. government who spoke the court and who was quoted by those who were in the courtroom. So that tells me that this one, which does deal with the extradition request by the United States, that it might be the same lawyer, this British lawyer retained, paid for by U.S. taxpayers. But I don't know that for sure. But I'm assuming that the prosecutor was representing the U.S.
Because I heard her saying, using that word prosecutor, and right away I was kind of a little baffled, as to whom she was referring to.
Well, there would have to be a QC, a Queen's Counselor, I think, to be the prosecutor. And I think that guy is a Queen's Counselor. Yes, I remember. I forget his name. He is a QC. So I don't know. We hope we find out who the prosecutor was, what he said. But Jen is pointing out here that whatever, despite what you heard, this case is not about hacking. So, okay, he put forward the American argument that this was a hacking case. Again, that word doesn't appear in the indictment. And I don't know what his lawyers said, Julian's lawyers, if they said anything or if it was only his statement. We only have that one sentence. I would have hoped that they pointed out that he was just trying to, as Jen says here, this case is about a journalist and a publisher who had conversations with a source about accessing material. I add material that she had legal access to, since Manning had top secret clearance, who encouraged that source to provide material and who spoke to that source about how to protect their identity. This is protected activity that journalists engage in all the time. Any prosecution and extradition of Mr. Assange having done so or alleged to have done so will place a massive chill on investigative journalism in the world. I bloody well hope that Jen Robinson said those exact words inside the courtroom today, because that is the crux of the issue. This is a bogus indictment. There is no crime here that was committed. It's a joke. As you know, Kim.com, who was on the vigil the day of Assange's arrest, when we did also an emergency or a special vigil like we're doing today, he said that he had read it or looked over it, and he said this is a joke. And I hadn't read it at the time, but now I have, and it is a joke. And that should be the crux of this issue about extradition. Is it a legitimate indictment or not? How could the UK turn a guy over to the US when it's a flimsy, bogus indictment? So that's why the US has till June 12th to add more charges. But they appear to need Chelsea Manning to give the testimony in order to have that superseding indictment that would replace this one, this placeholder. Yes. She's not testifying, and that's why she's in jail. And they also, Dominic Dumschat-Berg was also given I think that's his first name, that was also apparently got a letter from the prosecutors in the U.S. saying they wanted him to testify. So they are moving in concentric circles around Assange to people to try to get them to incriminate him so they can come up with this superseding indictment. Right. And there's no cooperation from Dumschat-Berg, apparently, because that letter was leaked and he wasn't supposed to do that. And Manning sits in an Alexandria, Virginia prison right now, refusing to testify.
It is sort of interesting, though, what you were saying is that Chelsea Manning is refusing to cooperate. And I'm surprised this Dominic Dumschat-Berg obviously isn't willing to cooperate. And it doesn't look like this other guy, the one who's been in prison now for about 2 years, the man that the CIA is accusing of stealing the Vault 7 secrets. It doesn't look like he's cooperating either. They're not getting anything out of him. So all these different threads that the US government is trying to tie together against Julian, I mean, they don't seem to be working for the time being.
Yes, and that guy, his name escapes me, the alleged source for the Vault 7 is, I believe at one point he was being held completely naked, chained to the floor.
Yes, that's what I read that as well, yeah.
This is the enlightened democratic government of the United States, how they treat someone who hasn't been convicted of anything yet. Like, where's the guy going to go? Isn't a jail cell with a key enough?